now, and over to you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our two-part series, Let's Talk Transition. Our topic today is Transitioning to College, a roadmap for reasonable accommodations under 504. We are very excited to have attorney Robert Tudisco back with us for this discussion. He is a nationally recognized author, motivational speaker, and practicing attorney advocate for students with special needs and their families. Today, he will address the legal challenges that occur with a student's transition to college. You can find out more information about him on our website at www.spednetwilton.org. Also, all the information from today's webinar, including his PowerPoint, will be posted to our Facebook page and also our website. Just for your information, our second webinar in this series is next Tuesday, June 23rd at 9:30 a.m., featuring attorney Colleen Massey, who will discuss what to do when your child with needs turns 18. Both of these webinars will be recorded and uploaded to our website, which I just gave you, but I'll give it again, www.spednetwilton.org, and our Facebook page also for future viewing. Your moderators today are Eve Kessler, founder of SpedNet Wilton, Carolina Corrigan, co-president of SpedNet, and I'm Janine Kelly. Just a few ground rules. I know some of you have been watching these webinars since our beginning, but I just want to go through them again. Feel free to ask questions at the end of the presentation through the Q&A button. We can keep track through the Q&A of who's answering the questions, so it's better to use that button than the chat. Also, please be mindful that this is an open forum that's being recorded, and we can't necessarily guarantee confidentiality, so you may not want to reveal any private information with your questions. Also, finally, the documents and information provided in this webinar by the speaker and by the moderators are for informational purposes only and are not intended to replace the need for legal or therapeutic advice. And with that being said, I will turn you over to Robert Tudisco. Hey, Robert.
Hi, how you doing? Thank you for having me. Thanks to everyone for logging on to the webinar. I think this is a particularly important topic for all students because the transition from K-12 to post-secondary is probably the most challenging for any student. But for students with ADHD, learning disabilities, executive functioning impairment, it becomes, it magnifies exponentially. And so that is something that parents need to be prepared for, to be proactive about. Students with ADHD and learning disabilities are extremely bright students and they have high potential, but they are at risk. They're 3 times more likely to be held back compared to those without ADHD. They're twice as likely to drop out of high school compared to those without ADHD, 7 times less likely to graduate college in 4 years than those without. And for you parents who are concerned about your students maybe being on the 6 or 7 year plan at college, it is an issue that needs to be addressed. And they're 3 times more likely to get suspended or some type of disciplinary action, which is a lot more complicated once they step over to college or some type of post-secondary environment for a number of reasons that we'll get to. Now, just to cover an overview of what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to be talking about the nature of these disabilities, their impact on this particular transition, the social impact of transitioning students with disabilities post-secondary, the legal impact because the law that governs accommodations for students with disabilities in post-secondary environment radically changes from the K-12 environment. And really to talk about some proactive strategies. And I think it was a really good title that SpedNet came up with, a roadmap to accommodations, because this really is a way to give you some practical tools to help you transition your son or daughter to that environment. Because when they do, unfortunately, in many ways, they're going to be doing it without you. And so to build on this and to learn these proactive principles to kind of pass the advocacy torch onto them is going to be really important. All right. I'm going to talk a little bit about ADHD, and I do this for a couple of reasons. Number one, I am ADHD. I was diagnosed about 1999, so that's long time ago, 21 years ago. And I have 55 years of experience with it, but it is also a hub disorder in the sense that it's rare that their ADHD is present alone. typically there is some type of co-occurring learning disability or co-occurring mental health condition with ADHD, and the executive functioning impairment that's inherent in ADHD is really at the heart of the problem that a lot of these students have in transitioning to post-secondary. Okay, so what is ADHD? It's a neurobiological disorder affecting the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is responsible for executive functioning. Okay, it's a neurotransmitter dysfunction. The three main neurotransmitters are dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. Okay, executive functioning are, a lot of people think of it as the office manager in your brain. You see the picture here of the conductor of the symphony. Executive functions are typically organization, prioritization, time perception, impulse control, self-regulation, tension regulation, and short-term memory. Okay, time perception is a significant problem because typically people think of those with ADHD as not able to manage their time effectively, which is true, but that is only the tip of the iceberg. Okay, if you have an executive functioning impairment like ADHD, you have difficulty organizing anything. Time is a lot more complicated because it's not just the ability to manage it. It is inherent inability to perceive time in a very real sense, okay? You have to think about it this way. If our brains, those of us with ADHD, are moving at the speed of light, and I'm talking now about cognitive hyperactivity, someone doesn't have to necessarily be bouncing off the walls. There's a lot going on internally in terms of their thought process, and that really moves at the speed of light. And if you kind of compare that with the slow functional reality of time outside, there's a huge disconnect there. It's about not understanding effectively how long a task is going to take to do, always thinking you have more time than you do, and also because of those neurotransmitters I talked about, norepinephrine is essentially adrenaline. Because there's difficulty, and I'll show you a slide in a moment that addresses that, these kids typically will not be able to do anything unless it's an emergency. They need to create that sense of adrenaline because it compensates for what's not working properly. Okay? Self-regulation also becomes an extremely important problem when these kids transition to post-secondary, because when they go off to college, they're pretty much on their own. They don't have the structure that you're providing in the home. They don't have the highly structured environment of a high school. It's up to them to self-initiate, and a lot of kids with an executive functioning impairment have difficulty doing that. Okay, the neurotransmitters. If you look at an example would be in science class in middle school, you might have learned that if there's a hot pan on the stove, or the stove is hot and you place your hand on it, a signal goes from your hand up to your body, up to your brain, excuse me, telling you that it's hot and you should remove your hand. And so we have this kind of perception of you plug in a light into the wall and the electricity goes up the wire and the light bulb goes on. But that's not how it works in the human body, okay? Essentially, it's not one connected wire. It is a series of disconnected wires. And you can see these on the slide here. The disconnection is bridged by those neurotransmitters, which have to be flowing correctly, and there has to be specific receptors to receive them. Otherwise, there is a functional break in the system. Okay, and that is why a lot of these kids will flood themselves with dopamine or adrenaline to essentially compensate for something that's not working correctly. Now, executive functioning versus ADHD, okay? Executive functioning is really symptomatic in the sense that it is, the executive functions are all of those things I listed in the slide with the conductor. In this particular slide, you can see you can have a functioning you can have an executive functioning impairment that can be mild or more serious as you move towards the center of this target here. The center is most severe executive functioning impairment, which really kind of crosses over into diagnosable ADHD. So to say it a simpler way, you can have executive functioning impairment and not have ADHD. But if you have ADHD, you definitely have significant executive functioning impairment. And those executive functions are really necessary and are called upon constantly by the post-secondary environment. And if a student is not prepared, then they are really at risk to fail, to crash and burn. And if you add to that another functional disability, for instance, a reading disorder, dyslexia, something involving calculations, dyscalculia, there are an exponential level of difficulties that these students will face. Okay. This is a visualization I came up with to understand my own thought process when it comes to that cognitive hyperactivity that I mentioned earlier. Okay, New York City, you can see a skyline down there, is the center of finance and culture and fashion and most things that we know in a civilized society. Okay, and people come from all over the world to New York because of that. Now, instead of having a number of international airports, let's just say for a moment that you had a poorly run landing strip, okay? You still have these planes flying in from all over the world, but they've got no place to land. And that's this thought process that's constantly swirling around in their heads. But if one of those planes had an emergency, it would get instant clearance to land because it's an emergency. It's that constant craving of a crisis situation. And people with ADHD typically will gravitate towards crisis situations, and in many cases even create a crisis situation because it's a means of forced prioritization. It's the only way we can move forward sometimes. We live our lives putting out fires and putting out fires. Once the crisis is over, there's really nothing to kind of prod you to keep moving forward. And that becomes a problem when these kids go on to college because class attendance is not mandatory, they're on their own for the first time, and all of that structure is gone. And so they will typically flounder, and there are added problems that they face. Now, talking about learning disabilities for a minute, are neurologically based processing problems that can interfere with specific basic learning skills. I mentioned earlier dyslexia, reading and word recognition, decoding, dysgraphia, handwriting, dyspraxia, motor skills. Phonemic awareness is another one that often is mistaken for ADHD because that essentially is an inability to equate phonetic sounds with the written word. And so when there is that disconnect, a lot of times the students will kind of tune out, and it appears as if it's an attention disorder, but it really isn't. And depending on the curriculum of the school that they're going to, there may be reading requirements, there may be math or statistical requirements that they have to take, and it can really be a nightmare for some of these kids. Proactively, what you need to do is understand the reasons why they need particular services in their IEP when they're at the K-12 level or in their 504 plan. And the trick now, as they are graduating and moving on to the post-secondary environment, the trick really is, how do you take that IEP or that 504 plan and translate them into accommodations, reasonable accommodations that you can make a request of at the college, or if they're going to a trade school, or if they're going straight into the working environment, accommodations on the job. Identifying what their needs are, the history of what's worked and what hasn't worked when they were in K-12, so that you can really develop a roadmap and work with the disability office or human resources or whatever the case may be. Now, they can interfere with specific processes and also with a higher level of skills such as executive functioning, adding to the stress level, organization, time planning, abstract reasoning, long or short-term memory. And again, with that visualization of the airplanes, it's really important that you understand there are two types of memory, okay? One of them, if you think of your computer has two types of memory. One is how much information can the computer hold? Essentially the size of the file cabinet, okay? And it's interesting that people with ADHD typically have remarkable long-term memory. The other type of memory is where the problem is, and that is short-term memory. On your computer, there is something known as RAM, random access memory. And that is the amount of information that can be working at one time, the desktop, so to speak. And that is where people with ADHD typically have a significant impairment, okay? That leads essentially to attention problems because of the difficulty with coordinating all of these thoughts. There are organizational issues, there is a time perception problem, and all of this falls on the shoulders of someone who is an adolescent essentially on their own for the first time in their lives. So it really can be a recipe for disaster if you don't take some proactive steps that we're going to discuss here today. All right. I talked before about ADHD rarely being present alone. 65 to 70% of cases, it's present with some type of co-occurring condition or learning disability. But bringing the two of them together or more, sometimes there are 2 or 3 conditions, can really magnify the problems, okay? And it's very important for those of you who have always been concerned about discussing ADHD or discussing a disability with your child, or your child's difficulty in accepting their own disability. These disabilities are performance deficits. They are not intelligence deficits. That is a very, very important distinction to make. They are not smarter or less smart. They are just different, and they process information very differently than those without an executive functioning impairment, okay? And so it's very important that you bridge that conversation, especially when your child might be going off to college, okay? Let's see. These are, I put this slide in because there are various points of transition that students with executive functioning impairment find very, very difficult. The most significant that we're talking about today is high school to college or college to the workforce. But just to understand how this works, 3rd to 4th grade is usually the first time these kids run into difficulty, okay? Prior to 3rd or 4th grade, students are evaluated based upon how well they get along with the other students and basically how intelligent they are. Around 3rd or 4th grade, a number of administrative tasks are introduced into their lives. And when I sit and I talk with these kids in my practice and ask them essentially, what is it that you don't like about school? What is it that makes you angry about school? And a lot of times, more often than you would think, they will say, it's not that this year the work was that much harder, it's that there were so many more things I had to remember to do. Also, generally in the curriculum, as they go from elementary school to middle school, teachers will try and have them stand on their own. You're going to have to do this on your own as you get older. If there's an impairment there, that student will need a lot more structure as they go through this system. And so that is why it's very important to be looking at what's going on, requesting accommodations, requesting services in an IEP if it's necessary. All right. Now, this is the K-12 student. It's not that the work is harder, it's that there's so many more things I have to remember this year. What else do they have to remember? Besides the work and the homework, they've got papers that they have to keep track of. They have to remember to bring their lunch. They have to bring their lunch money. They have to coordinate their different books. A lot of times these kids will forget the notebooks or to bring the books home. Sometimes a middle school or high school accommodation in a 504 plan might be a second set of books at home to alleviate that as a problem. They're having the right notebook for class, having a pencil. You would think that that is something that is so basic. I cannot tell you when I grew up the amount of anxiety. I was the kid that never, ever had a pen in class, okay? Or time becomes a factor now, okay? And this is worse as they transition to post-secondary because they're getting timed projects and they're not having check-ins with a professor or a teacher. When they go on to college, typically they don't get any feedback at all. There's maybe a midterm and a final. And these kids don't realize how bad they're doing until it's too late. There's also another aspect of ADHD that we're not very good self-perceivers. Okay, I never realized, for instance, what a terrible driver I was until I got married and my wife told me. You know, seeing yourself as others from the outside perceive you, it can be a real wake-up call sometimes. Now, transitioning from high school to college. It's difficult for anybody, but there's a complete lack of structure, support, and accountability. They're away from home for the first time. There's no feedback. And medication management and the potential for diversion are also a problem, okay? I say this a lot, but if you take a moment to think about it, high school, middle school, elementary school are probably the closest thing to prison that these kids will ever go through, even if they're law-abiding citizens for the rest of their lives. It's a highly structured environment. The bells ring. You have to be here. You have to be there. They get their time in the yard every day. They, you know, they're constantly counting heads. If you take someone from that highly structured environment and kind of cut them loose in space, which is essentially what happens when you send someone with an executive functioning impairment and a learning disability off on their own to college in an unstructured environment, there is no way that they are going to be able to succeed without some type of outside support, okay? And you also have to factor in, at this age group, the thing they fight against the most is your intervention in their lives as parents, okay? But they don't realize the amount of structure and support that you provide until they don't have it anymore. And these things are all stripped of them in, you know, in this same time frame as they go off to college, okay? Medication is another issue that is significant because a lot of times parents are providing or developing a medication plan and giving them the medication on a regular schedule. A lot of these kids will tell me, when I went off to college, I don't think I need the medication as often as my mom gave it to me or as often as the school nurse gave it to me. And so I think I want to take it when I need it. There's two problems there. One is that at the end of the month, there is a surplus of medication. And in that environment, the second problem is that is very dangerous because by and large, stimulant medications are used, prescribed for ADHD, and many antidepressants as well are controlled substances, and there is the potential threat of diversion, okay? So those are two significant problems. Now, in terms of developing a way to proactively address that concern, if a student came to me at the age of 16 or 17 and said, you know what, my parents and my doctor don't understand how I think, and I think this is too much medication or too little medication, or I want to take it on a different schedule. I think that that information is important, is crucial, and no one knows what they're going through like they do. But in that situation, it's important, A, to have that conversation with your child, and B, develop a new medication plan with yourself as the parent, with your child, and with their doctor. And also, you have to account for where are their medicational needs going to be met if they are going to a school that's 1,000 miles away, that's 600 miles away. Is there going to be a local practitioner in case there is an issue? So these are things that you have to proactively think about and discuss with your child to develop a plan, a proactive plan for their transition. And incidentally, just as an aside, I think probably if there's one thing that you take away from a webinar like this, it's talk to your children. Don't assume what they're thinking. Don't assume that you know what is being done, or you know, that they're going to be carrying the ball the way you want them to. Sit down and have this conversation. Even if they disagree with you, you can address it. And it's a lot of times, you know, I don't have a magic wand here, okay? And I can't provide all of the ironclad answers, but this can mean the difference in many cases between navigating a minefield with a map in your hands versus being chased through one blindfolded, okay? One at least gives you the lay of the land and the ability to make some choices. They may not always be the correct ones, but that's very important, and you have to include your child in that. Okay, let's talk about the transition. It's often magnified by the disability. There are factual and social challenges. They're dealing with relationships. They're dealing with being away from home for the first time. They have to do things to manage their lives that don't necessarily translate into a grade, but it's still a life skill that they're learning on their own. And how are you preparing them to do that? There are also significant changes in the law that you need to be aware of in order to develop a proactive plan. Now, the law changes significantly for all students, okay? But there are significant changes for students with disabilities. Okay, I'm going to talk about these a little bit. From K to 12, under federal law, it is the obligation of the school district to seek out students that live within their boundaries, evaluate them, and to develop either services or accommodations to meet their special needs. Okay, and that could be done in two ways, either with an individualized education plan, or an IEP, or a 504 plan. This is grossly oversimplifying it, but if you think about it this way, typically 504 plans deal with accommodations and IEPs deal with services that may be necessary or placement size. You can get accommodations in an IEP and you can get services in a 504, so it can be a little bit more complicated, but that's the general rule, okay? Now, there are a number of changes in the law that are significant. One is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, which provides for IEPs for students with disabilities from K to 12, disappears when they either graduate high school or they turn 21, if they're still getting services at high school. So the IEP is gone. 504 is not an education statute. It is an anti-discrimination statute, and essentially basically mandates that students can't be discriminated against based upon their disability. And so they are still entitled to accommodations under Section 504. However, they're very different. In college, for instance, or in the working world, there is no 504 plan. And the reason for that is the burden that was previously on the local educational agency, the school district. Once they graduated high school, the student, the law changes and it becomes now the student's responsibility to self-report their disability, to provide documentation about it, and to request reasonable accommodations. And it's even more complicated than that, because when these students go to college, there's another federal law, the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA. When you were a parent of a student in middle school or high school or elementary school, that was your biggest friend. That law ensures that you have unlimited, unrestricted, and completely private access to your child's school records, okay? When your child becomes an adult and graduates and goes off to college, you no longer have that right. Your child is now an adult and it's their right. You do not have a right to their college transcripts, their information. The school legally cannot speak with you, okay? So your student, your son or daughter, is now going to be required to self-report their disability, to request accommodations and provide documentation. And why is that a problem? Well, first of all, in far too many cases, parents do all of the advocacy for their children and as a means of protecting them. And these kids are not in a position to understand their own needs and advocate for themselves, okay? Number two, which is a more difficult problem, is that these students are unwilling to do it. They will often tell me that dyslexia or ADHD or some other disability was something that my parents told me I had, and it always made me feel stupid or broken. And when I go off to college, the last thing I want to do is report that I have this disability. I want to fit in with everybody else. I'm starting fresh in a new place, and I'm not going to go to the disability office. I don't want to be with the disabled kids. And so that essentially puts them in a very bad position legally, because if they fail because of accommodations they could have had, if they didn't request them and they didn't alert the school and register as a disabled student, legally they have no recourse, okay? And that is why it's important to develop a plan while you are looking for colleges. Essentially, if your child has a disability, my advice is to not only look for colleges that would be appropriate, look for disability offices, okay? And have your child in a position where they feel comfortable discussing their disability, discussing what their needs are, what type of help they need, and not being afraid to ask for it. This is a very important time in their development as you develop this transition plan, because you really should be preparing them to advocate for themselves as they move forward in life. That is really one of the most important things I can leave you with here. How do you prepare for that eventuality? Okay. Now, also we talked about the lack of structure, inability to advocate for themselves, the absence of feedback, no daily support from their parents. This is a recipe for disaster if you're not prepared to address it. Now, this was the student I showed you a slide of earlier with all of the administrative tasks while they're in middle school or high school. And now they've gone away to college. They have to do their own laundry for the first time, okay? Are they getting enough sleep? Are they eating right? How are they managing their medication? Okay, is there a romance that's distracting them from what else is going on or adding stress to them? Okay, is there a sport involved, or maybe even a job or something else? All of these administrative tasks are what get in the way of these students performing to their potential, okay? So that's really what you have to take into consideration. All of this mess of stuff, almost none of which has to do with the actual subject matter that they're learning about in school. Now, okay, we talked about the different statutes and FERPA. Now, a word about FERPA. Oh, before I get there, this is also very important. Your child having a disability like dyslexia, like bipolar disorder, like ADHD, in and of itself does not guarantee that they're entitled to services or accommodations, okay? You have to show that the disability substantially impacts a major life activity. And for a student, their major life activity is learning. So it's relatively easy to do. However, you have to take that step. You can't just say, well, here's a doctor here's a letter from a doctor that diagnosed him with ADHD. We need accommodations. You will or may be asked to show how the accommodations you're asking for relate to the disability that your child has and how it symptomizes, okay? For instance, the diagnosis, say, of ADHD is important. But for younger students, it's not as important to me as an attorney as the specific testing results that I get from a thorough neuropsych evaluation. And the subtests will contain information about their decoding process or difficulties with it, their ability to structure a sentence, their short-term memory, their processing speed. All of those would translate into, for instance, parents might say, my child has ADHD, he wants extended time for tests. Why? You have to show, for instance, many people with a functional impairment like that will have a slow processing speed that is tested, and you can show test results. That evaluation can be a blueprint, should be a blueprint for the accommodations you're seeking from the college, okay? Now, what if your child has an IEP? How do you convert that? Well, even though, first of all, the college, if your child has a 504 plan, they're not bound by that 504 plan to provide the same accommodations. However, you have a starting point, a launching pad, if you will, to take that 504 plan to the disability office and say, this is what the school felt was necessary and we felt was necessary, and this is what worked for him, this is what he needs. You are in a much stronger position in doing that. The other thing is, if you have an IEP, you should take the IEP to the disability office and say, no, he doesn't get an IEP here in college, but we need specific accommodations. And the IEP will list, for instance, extended time, perhaps a check-in with a teacher on longer term projects that might be necessary, and kind of go with what works. The other thing is that the IDEA also requires that when students are between 14 and 16, that the school, as part of the IEP process, put together a transition plan. That is crucial. And the most important thing about that is not only should you take that transition plan very seriously, but you should involve your son or daughter with you when you go to those meetings. That is very important. And also you should focus and have the meeting focus on how are the services and accommodations listed in his IEP, how do they translate to what we should be asking for in college, all right? That is going to be a process that will really develop what your game plan is going to the disability office when they get to college. All right, we talked about child find. It's no longer, I mentioned to you before that in the K-12 level, that the burden is on the school district to evaluate these students and to evaluate them and provide services or accommodations. That component of IDEA and Section 504 and the ADA is called child find, okay? It's the school's responsibility to find those children, evaluate them, and provide it, and that disappears when they graduate from high school. Okay. As I said before, IDEA is gone, their IEP is gone, they still have 504 and the ADA, the burden shifts to them, so it just looks very different, and you have to be prepared for that difference. You have to document your disability. This is another important aspect of developing a game plan, okay? And that is request to the extent you can a full evaluation of the school as your child is getting close to second year, third year of high school. You want as recent an evaluation as you can to bring to the college, the trade school, or wherever you're going to ask for accommodations, okay? But your son or daughter must step up and request those accommodations based upon their disability and how it symptomizes. So not only is it important for parents to understand those evaluations and understand those needs, they have to be able to make their son or daughter understand them in a functional way so they can request those accommodations on their own. Okay. Now, under the law, I talked about a transition plan. Involve your child in that actively. Very important, okay? We covered this. Do not feel the slightest bit concerned about bringing the 504 plan or the IEP to the college disability office and finding out where those, what services are available. Also, depending on your son or daughter, you should look at things like, where is the dorm located compared to the disability office? Is it easy to get to? I know if it's on the other side of campus, my son or my daughter will never go. These are things that you have to think about proactively. All right. We talked about students' reluctance to report, which becomes a functional impairment for them. So you really have to get them involved in that process. Okay. Now, we talked about FERPA, and this is important. You are out of the loop when your child becomes an adult. You can, one way around this as a practical strategy is to get your child to sign a waiver, okay? They can waive their FERPA rights and have you be involved in getting their grades and the advocacy process, etc. It's very important that you discuss it with your son or daughter. Even if they disagree and they say, I don't want to sign the waiver, you've had the conversation and you know what you're dealing with, okay? Now, if your son or daughter signs the waiver, and most colleges have their own form for this in the packet when kids will come to the college, it doesn't operate the same way it does in high school. Okay. In high school, if your son or daughter wasn't doing well, you might get a call from the assistant principal or the principal, you know, Johnny's grades aren't doing well. Is everything okay at home? A FERPA waiver will only permit the school to speak to you if you make the call. Okay. You still have to initiate that process. So it's very important you keep that in mind. All right, talk to your children to address this proactively. Understand the social and legal challenges. Make sure they understand the social and legal challenges in transition. Develop a proactive plan. Have the conversation, speak to the disability office, have them sign the waiver or have the conversation, okay? Medication management. Again, medication's not a magic bullet. It is a useful tool that helps children, students, adults, manage their disability and make positive choices in their life, but they have to do that. Important to have a medication plan going in. If a change is necessary, get everybody together to change the plan and have resources available locally. I mentioned that earlier as well. Okay, diversion is essentially where students are sharing their stimulant medication with students who are not diagnosed or not taking it pursuant to a prescription. Stimulant medication is a Schedule II controlled substance. Money does not have to change hands. If you give your friend a pill, it's the same as selling in the eyes of the law. You're subject to prosecution, expulsion, or feeding into the social stigmas that this medication somehow gets these kids stoned or it's a social drug. Right. It's important that your son or daughter understand that their medication is a controlled substance. They have to safeguard their medication, take it according to a plan, or if they want to change the plan, initiate a process and let other people be involved. Don't share meds ever, and parents need to have this conversation with their child. Also report changes in medication to the doctor, because depending on how old they are and what stage of development they're in, their medicational needs may be changing as they get older. Okay, another way to address this transition proactively is known as executive functioning or ADHD coaching. This is, if I had to break down coaching in one word, I would use the word empowerment, okay? It is a very specific process that is a partnership between a student and a coach. It is a talent-based model. The student sets goals, not the parents' goals, not the coach's goals, their own goals. And the coach and the student work together to plot a course to achieve those goals. It helps students develop structure, support, and accountability for themselves. Okay, it's like the give a man a fish versus teaching a man to fish. This is crucial for students who need that structure. And if you believe that your son or daughter may be reluctant to go to the disability office for help, a coach is something they can do on their own. Typically, coaching sessions are done over the phone or through Skype, especially now. And I like the fact that it's a talent-based model. I can't say enough about that, because these kids have been spending their lives getting negative feedback. Okay, they're not quick enough, they're not getting good enough grades, they're distracted. A coach will help a student see where their talents are, because navigating a disability like this, I can tell you from my own personal experience, is all about understanding your disability and yourself enough that you can gravitate towards your strengths and navigate around or dance around those weaknesses. But you have to accept and recognize that you have certain talents, okay? And coaching is something that really brings that out. I guess a best analogy I can give you is, let's say, a tennis coach. That coach can't manufacture the talent of their athlete, but they can help them recognize that they're stronger on one side versus another, help them play to their game, okay? And that's really what a coach does. I am not a coach, so I'm not selling coaching, but I've been coached successfully. I used to run a nonprofit that provides coaches for students at the high school and college age throughout the country, and it really is a remarkable intervention for them. And it also can encourage self-advocacy. Other proactive strategies: exercise. When my son went to college, I could not believe the fitness facilities that were available to them free of charge at these schools. Take advantage of it. There are significant studies that show that exercise, the correlation between exercise and brain function, not just attention disorders, which there's a huge connection with, but depression, anxiety, a whole host of these things, okay? Especially if your child does not want to take medication or you're reluctant about having them take medication, do everything else you can do, because they're going to need more support. I've been taking medication for 21 years to manage my ADHD, and I have to tell you, I run religiously to manage it. And my running is as important to me, if not more so, than my medication sometimes. So developing coping strategies, looking inside, what works for you, developing a system. A coach can be very, very helpful with that. Developing a plan for their medication management, accommodations, managing their school records, and self-advocacy. Okay, we went through this slide already. High stakes testing. If you need to get accommodations for the SAT or ACT, such as extended time, for instance, don't just take it for granted. A lot of these cases where I represent students, a lot of these are won on appeal. there was some bad press the College Board got a number of years ago that in this highly competitive environment, people were asking for extended time when they didn't need it. And so they really are making people come in with extensive documentation to provide, to substantiate why they need this, okay? And I do a lot of appeals on this to get this accommodation, these accommodations for students where it's necessary, okay? You have to, you're not seeking an advantage for your son or daughter. You're looking to level the playing field here. That's really the mindset you have to have. All right. Be proactive. Use the high school if you can. A lot of times parents will fight with the high school about whether to get an IEP or what services are necessary. You are essentially in the high stakes testing process. You are getting your student out of their hair, okay? You are asking the school to help you get them accommodations for the SAT or ACT because they're moving on, they're moving out of here. Try to capitalize on that if you've butt heads with the school in the past, okay? Don't give up if you're rejected. You may just need to provide more documentation or show, like I said before, the correlation between the symptom and the accommodation you're asking for. Practical pitfalls that you have to deal with are students reluctant to advocate for themselves. The other issue that doesn't get a whole lot of press is not just advocating to get these accommodations, but they may change as your child develops. Revisiting them, staying vigilant to make sure they're getting what the school agrees to. In college, there's a huge problem in the disability office granting accommodations and it getting lost somewhere between the disability office and some professor who's tenured and who's been doing things their way for 30 years and is not going to abide by those accommodations. You have to know that's coming and you have to deal with it by getting them out of that class or having the disability office intervene, however you need to do that. The follow-through can be the issue, the disconnect between the student and the disability office, which is where essentially coaching can really fill that gap if it's just not going to happen. But you have to think about that ahead of time to build this roadmap. All right, just to finish up here, students with ADHD and LD have a very high potential, but they are at risk. If transition challenges are best addressed proactively, they're not only going to survive college, they can really thrive there. They're going to be taking classes in their own major field of study. And the one thing you should be heartened about is that people with disabilities and with attention problems typically will do well when they're doing something they're interested in. And there is a much better environment for that in college, okay? Being proactive and addressing these transitions can really turn that high risk into high potential, okay? That's all I have for slides. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to field them now. If there's something more personal, my email address is listed there. You can also contact me individually.
There's a couple questions. I think you've touched about a few, but I'll just repeat them. What can you do as a student is 18 and you cannot see the records even though you're still paying for health?
Yeah, the main thing is, or really the only answer to that question about your access to their records is having them sign a FERPA waiver. If your child does not want to do that, there's really nothing that you can do.
Yeah, so the next one, if the student's willing, can they sign a release to have school staff include, I'm assuming, partners or executive functioning coach in school, communication, assignment deadlines, missed assignments, registration, etc. So I'm assuming that's the FERPA waiver or the waiver.
It is. I would just be careful about having waivers from multiple people. The school may be concerned about their own liability. And so I would what I would do is if the parent wants to be involved, I would have the child or the student sign a waiver giving the parent access. Maybe the coach, but if you think about it, the coach is really helping the student to help themselves. And so I would encourage your son or daughter to work with their coach on how to get the records, involve the parents, as opposed to having maybe trying to sign a waiver for 6 or 7 different people. That may just get out of control and unworkable.
So there's a question, can you recommend a good coach in the New York, Connecticut area?
I would say this, there are a number of coaches, and I've known literally hundreds of them. And I think we might have a couple actually on the call today. It depends. The only downside to coaching is that it will not work unless the student buys into the process. They have to step up and say, I want to do this. You can't force it on them. And I do this presentation a lot. And quite often when I'm talking about coaching and the benefits of it, I will see the light bulbs go off in the parents' faces, and I will get questions like, that's exactly what my daughter needs. How do I make her do this? You can't make them. And you also have to be careful about saying things like, okay, we're going to give you 1 semester to see how you do. If you fail, then you're going to have to use a coach. Now the coach has become the punishment. Okay, and that's not a good atmosphere to have. I would encourage your son or daughter to do as much research as possible on coaching. There are a number of YouTube videos on, for instance, the Edge Foundation that I used to run. We were picked up on CNN. We did a study on the impact of coaching on college students, and there are actually interviews with students, their peers, who talk about what it's like to work with a coach, and so on. I would not necessarily limit yourself to geographic region, because it's so important for the student to step up, and most of this is done remotely. I believe very strongly that the relationship and the rapport between the student and the coach is what's most important. I would do some research. At the Edge Foundation, the program administrator would talk to the student and the parents and maybe give them a list of 5 or 6 people she thought would be a good fit. She would encourage the student to make some phone calls to these coaches, just have a conversation and tell me if there's one of them that you would like to work with. Let the student choose. It's their thing. I can, if anyone wants to contact me individually, I could provide you some resources. I'd be happy to do that.
Oh, so here's are secondary schools receptive to the FERPA waiver?
By law, they have to be. Some schools may be more, maybe less inviting about it, but typically when you go to orientation lectures, and again, in our changing society with everything being virtual, I don't know how that's going to change. But I will tell you that schools are required legally to accept a FERPA waiver. And if you feel that there's reluctance to it, or they're putting you through hoops in order to get information, I would say that's probably not the best environment for your son or daughter. You really kind of have to think about that in terms of when you go visit schools and you're looking at disability offices and you're looking at what they offer, what's the environment, what's the climate at these schools? There are a number of schools that are very disability friendly environments. Lynn University for one, Landmark University is another that comes to mind. There are lists that are posted from time to time about, friendlier, open schools that really encourage students with learning differences.
So we have a question, is health affiliated with FERPA?
Say that again?
Is health affiliated with FERPA?
Health issues are a little bit more complicated because they involve medical issues. If, for instance, your son or daughter went to the student clinic at college, the FERPA waiver wouldn't cover that. The FERPA waiver covers education records. So for doctor's records, for health records in general, I'm imagining you would need a HIPAA waiver for that as well.
Okay, so here's, how do you find a good coach and what is their actual job title?
Their job title is ADHD, or we're seeing a lot more that say ADHD or executive functioning coach. You want to find a coach and look at their background. If they are, certainly if they're insured, how long they're doing it, what accreditations they have. Some coaches, ADHD coaching was a practice that spun off of executive life coaching. There was an executive life coach, and there's a very famous book on ADHD, Driven to Distraction. The wife of one of the authors, Nancy Rady, was an executive life coach, and Nancy is also ADHD and very involved in the community, and adapted a coaching, an executive life coaching model to address executive functioning impairment. And the world of ADHD coaching was born, and it is so necessary. And when students buy into the process, it's so incredibly effective. And actually, I can say that a good coach's job should be to get fired because the student doesn't need it anymore. So, you know, there are a number of resources. There's the ADHD Coaching Association. There are a number of coaching academies. There's the Edge Foundation. If anyone wants more information, I can provide them with some resources to look.
So we have, the issue when people type into the chat is that it disappears. But I see one question: where can you find the waiver? Where can you get? I'm assuming it's the FERPA waiver.
Okay, you can draw up a general FERPA waiver. However, typically what happens is when your son or daughter enrolls in a college, the school prefers to use their own form. So that is another question that you need to ask and make sure that the school has it on file. That is, you know, very important. Schools are funny about that. They want to see their own packet. They want to recognize their own materials, as opposed to something, you know, I've drafted FERPA waivers when I get involved in school discipline cases from time to time just to get records quickly. But, you know, generally the school will provide you with their form.
So here's it's a two-part question. What can families do now for college students with accommodations that had to go home for COVID but needed more accommodations? Now they're fighting with colleges to drop classes or get accommodations for learning at home. And then the second is, what types of accommodations should a student ask for if COVID comes back and they have to learn at home?
Well, number one, if COVID comes back, and I anticipate there's probably going to be second waves, the only good thing about it in this abysmal climate that we're in is that you now have the advantage of knowing what you struggled with the first time you went into a remote platform. So, for instance, students who are struggling that they need more services, or they cannot cope with the accessing their classes remotely and are failing because of it, they should immediately contact the disability office and explain what is not working and what they need and what they're requesting, okay? Unfortunately, this is something that we've never seen before. So we're kind of figuring this out as we go, okay? I think, though, that just by what I told you about 504 and how it works and how the legal burden shifts, it's very important that you document the difficulties that you or your son or daughter are having, so that you can say, listen, we were having this problem when it arose, and, you know, we alerted the school to it immediately. We're a registered student with a disability and our needs are changing. And you have to be very, very proactive with letting the school know that, and build a record that in case you have to fight with the school or you have to litigate, you have something that you could fall back on. We alerted the school, we told them. If there's a second wave of this and you know what you struggled with the first time, you're in a much better position to ask for what you need and why you need it, because you've seen this happen, okay? I have seen, by and large, because this is so unprecedented, schools being a lot more receptive to letting students drop classes late, because this has really thrown the whole world on its head. So I think that, and if the school says no, which is possible, you just have to keep fighting.
Yeah, and there's one that says some colleges were really helpful and others were not helpful. after the fact. So it was more of a statement than a question. So
Any others or?
not right now, but I usually, it takes a little time for them to type.
There is a statement in the chat. FERPA also permits a school to disclose personally identifiable information from education records of an eligible student, i.e. a student age 18 or older or enrolled in a post-secondary institution, to his or her parents if the student is a dependent student, as that term is defined in the Internal Revenue Code.
That is correct, and I'll point that out. There is an exception to the a student being an adult. The parent can still, under FERPA, get educational records if they are under certain narrow circumstances, if they're claiming their child still as a dependent on their tax return. But even if you are, I would still have that conversation with your child, and I would still have them sign a waiver. This way, you're not going back and forth with somebody at the school, sending it to their legal department to interpret. Time can be crucial. And remember something, when your student goes away to college, all of you parents know how much this costs, okay? If your student crashes and burns, your investment is at risk. But the investment in your child's sense of self-esteem, if this does not work, is something that you'll never be able to recover, possibly. So you really have to address these things proactively going in, okay? It's very, very important.
So I have a question, Robert, because it's kind of coming up now with this whole COVID background. Do you have a lot of students who are going into their freshman year or maybe even their sophomore year who, because of their needs, can actually request a gap year?
Okay.
And how would they go about doing that?
Well, I would certainly ask the school to defer enrollment for a year based upon this. I think that if you have a situation where you are concerned about remote learning for your child's disability, I think you have that much stronger of a case. But the bottom line is that you need to know when you start getting, as we approach the fall, and students start sending out applications and they start getting, I forget what they're called, first acceptance, or there are all these different categories that you can go through. Once my son graduated college, I shut the door on all of that information. But you really need to open up a dialogue with that school and also with your son or daughter, especially for kids with attentional problems. You may need to seriously consider either a gap year or starting out at, instead of going from a lot of structure to no structure, possibly somewhere in between, like a community college, which is essentially a less structured high school environment, but it's more structure than a traditional college would be. And there's two benefits to that. One is that they retain some structure. Typically, the community colleges are closer to home, so you also have the structure of the home. And in a year or 2 years, it's going to be easier for them to matriculate over to the four-year college of their choice, because they've kind of gotten their feet wet and developed some solid life skills when they through the community college process. Or not just a gap year can be important, because there are students who, one aspect of some of these disabilities that I neglected to mention was there is typically a 1/3 lag on social maturity. And many of these students are not ready emotionally to go out on their own and to do this. And so a gap year or two, in some cases, they will do better when they start college 2 years after they graduated high school. But that's something that you and your son or your daughter have to come up with. And I'll tell you this, going through this process as a parent and as an attorney who represents kids going through this process and families, I can honestly tell you, it is very easy for parents to want their children to do better and want them to get into a better school or what's considered a better school. And in many cases, the right fit for your son or daughter gets lost in the translation, okay? You know, one parent might say, but I think if they applied themselves more, they could get into a better school. The bottom line is there are a lot of kids who push their way into schools that are over their heads. And if they have a disability, that's a bigger problem, and they're not gonna access services the way they should be or accommodations, then basically it's a waste. And you know, there is, when my son went to college, it was a small liberal arts school in the Midwest. And the president of the school spoke to these kids and said, look, for the first time in 2 years, I'm going to tell you your SAT scores don't matter anymore. Your personal essay doesn't matter. You're great. You've been accepted here. Okay. Now it comes down to one thing, a gut call. Is this home? Do you feel comfortable here? And my son was very reluctant changing into that mindset. And I said, the guy's right. I mean, you have to feel like this is a place where you can succeed, whether it's the type of you know, learning environment that there is, whether it's the rest of the students, whether it's the access to home or the distance from home or whatever the case may be. And really just, you know, parent to parent, not necessarily legally, you really have to take that into consideration, especially if you have a child with learning differences.
We do have one other question through the chat. And what about parents who get court approval as limited guardians for the student?
If they are limited guardians for the student, then potentially they could sign the FERPA waiver if the guardianship allows them the ability to sign for the student. In that case, I would present the school with 3 things: the guardianship order, a FERPA waiver signed by the parent, and one signed by the student. Cover all of the bases. You don't want to be in a situation where the school's not recognizing it and you're insisting that you found an exception in the law and you're going back and forth. The school may be, you know, sending this to their compliance office. You want this to be as easy and as seamless as possible. So in that case, I would do all 3.
Yeah, so I think we had one more question in the Q&A, and I think you just touched on it. It was about, what about a transitional year for a student, which I think you just kind of touched on.
Yeah, the other thing is, be careful. A transitional year or a gap year should mean, are they going to work? Are they going to be doing something that is really going to be helping them either go to college or potentially deciding if they want to go to college? You know, they may decide that they want to start working right away. They may get a job and enjoy it. There really has to be a plan. What is the gap you're going to accomplish? Is it so they are going to be socially maturing enough to understand and cope with the concept of post-secondary education better? Is it to kind of wet their feet in the working world? Is it to maybe just take some time to decide what they want to do? That should be part of your transition plan. You know, if there's going to be a gap year or transitional year, what's the end game?
Yeah. So I think this is probably one of our last questions here. What about kids who doesn't have enough executive functioning to attend college? What help is available to them after high school?
There are a couple of things. If a student is significantly impaired to the extent that you don't think they can go to college, you know, the first step back would be a community college or a junior college. If you believe that their cognitive development or their academic development is so significantly impaired, they can either stay in high school, or through programs in the high school, many times they can qualify for services under IDEA up until they're 21. And those services may be transitional services, okay? So, don't think that, he's a senior in high school, he's 17, he's on the diving board, he's either got to jump in or, you may be able to negotiate them staying there if you believe that the impairments are significant enough that they're not ready to move on. That's why IDEA allows them up to high school graduation or up until the age of 21.
All right. Well, it seemed like people are kind of dropping out, and I think this was super helpful.
Very.
If there's any more
Thank
questions.
you so much. It was amazing. Robert's frozen.
No, I think he's just waiting.
No, I'm just waiting to see if there's another question. That's
I
all.
thought your screen was frozen.
Thank you. Yeah, well, if that's it, is there I saw something from the chat, Robert, what's the best time or how's the best to reach you?
You can reach me at my email address, robert@bargergains.com. There's also, you can reach me at robert@roberttudisco.com. And I know we're in web format, and I think this works really well because it gives people a convenience, but one of my favorite things to do is to speak at colleges around the country. And if your son or daughter goes to a school that has a visiting lecture program, I really do a lot of presentations for students at schools. What happens now with my disability when I go to the workforce or dealing with, college and those issues. And so feel free to offer my name.
That's great. Will do.
All right, great. So with that, thank you so much. And we're gonna log off. All right.
Thank you for having me.
Enjoy the summer. Thank you, Robert.
Have a great summer. Thank you, everybody, for checking in.